up, y'all? Jazz Shepherd here. Larry Legend, All-Star Game. I love Larry Byrd. He's a cerebral player. Smarts takes you a long way. Today we're going to talk about 12 Columbia records that I love, that are important, that people should own. Not all fit all those categories, but when I went through, this is the stuff I wanted to talk about. Columbia is the big leagues. Let's make no mistake about it. If you were a jazz musician, as much as you love Blue Note and Prestige and Riverside, Argo, Emersy, the West Coast labels, those were big markers. But if you got to Columbia, that was the major leagues. Of course, RCA, Decca, Capitol, those three labels are also doing jazz. But Capitol's very white, very limited to easy, accessible stuff. RCA, it's a pretty small sample size of what they do that's real jazz, and very little of it's black. Decca is kind of being shoved out of the marketplace by the 50s and the 60s. They're kind of gone. I can't remember who absorbs Decca. Someone I'm sure does. Probably Columbia. But Columbia is huge. They are omnipresent in almost every field of music, from country to bluegrass to jazz to early rock to easy listening to beer polka songs. Columbia will put it all out, and there's no distinction via the serial number. It all starts at 500 and moves its way up to 3,000 or so before they switch their serial codes. So you can't just see a 700 series Columbia and be like, oh, it's going to be great jazz. It can be anything. The cover should tell you what it is. And truthfully, great jazz on Columbia is maybe one every 25 records. There's a great jazz record. And maybe one every 10, there's a jazz record that's whatever. Columbia in 1954 launches the 500 series, and it's 12-inch LPs. And you can see right there, that's a very old first pressing of Chet Baker. This is number 549. I just got this record. Part of why I want to show you this is Baker was a West Coast trumpet player, a very bad drug habit, a lot of James Dean, a lot of Bad Boy, a lot of the Rebel, Elvis before Elvis. See what I'm saying? Chet's kind of dangerous. But what makes him okay? That lack of pigmentation. Columbia was willing to be risky with a guy like Baker very early on in their LP series. 549. And contemporary with this on Columbia is Rosemary Clooney, which is really easy listening, vocal, a little bit of gospel, and the jazz they're issuing is Armstrong, vault Ellington stuff, vault Armstrong stuff, some vault Basie, vault Goodman, Teddy Wilson. So the jazz that Columbia's putting out is pretty much stuff from earlier times that they're putting on the LP. It's very safe, and it's either white or it's black guys that had recorded 15 years ago that we're no longer afraid of. Chet Baker comes into the mix here. It's a great record. He is playing with strings, which of course makes it even safer. So it's not a hard driving jazz record. But he excels. He plays wonderfully and beautifully. And a lot of Baker stuff from the West Coast later is fantastic. His Riverside sides are great. I love Chet Baker. And it's just kind of cool to see the old Columbia label that predates the 6i logo, which most of us are so happy to find, which comes not long after this. So we're seeing Columbia right off the bat being very safe in its broad strokes. It's not going to take a lot of risk. And they issue a lot of stuff from the swing era, the Dixie stuff that was recorded in the 30s and the late 40s. They're putting it on LP. If you're going to own one Betty Goodman record, it doesn't have to be this one, but it better have Sing, Sing, Sing on it. And I cannot tell people enough This is what swing sounds and looks like. This is what swing does. The great Fletcher Henderson did a lot of Benny Goodman's arranging, a brother. If you can think of some of this stuff as whoa, like swirling dubstep kind of sounds, a lot of it's the same placing, the same shapes, the same movements. It's just we're using different instruments because this is what we had available to us in the day. But we're creating a wall of sound, and I hope that you guys can go onto your loud system, play Benny Goodman's Swing, Swing, Swing. Play it loud. Play it as loud as you're comfortable hearing it. Sit back and listen to that shit, and it'll beat your eardrums. And imagine hearing that by a live band in a dance hall somewhere. It must have been just electrifying. Goodman's a bad guy. He's a bad player. He really had a great sense of swing. He heard what the black guys were doing, and as an impoverished Jew, it wasn't hard to garner the empathy to play this music. It wasn't hard to have the expression of sorrow and the joy that this music brings you and releases that pain and sorrow. There's counter movements. It's only Basie swings like this, and then we're talking Goodman. Goodman swings, man, and Sing, Sing, Sing is to me a wonderful, wonderful highlight of the swing era, and it's accessible, but yet it's still just bust chops. It takes no prisoners. Third guy, sorry, I want to show you here. And listen to Sing, Sing, Sing. I challenge you to go listen to that. Tell me what you think. It's bad. Ellington ends up with a lot of stuff on Columbia, and it's very convoluted. The great Al Hibbler, what a singer. They sure did. You know why? Because I don't get around much anymore. Thought I'd go, but as far as the door. I think it's always good to hear Ellington songs with lyrics sometimes. A lot of his stuff will have versions out there with both. And when you hear the words, it defines some of the melody for you that he shapes in his songs. And it allows some of the counter movements and the horns and the different sections to really become clear to you how he's pretty much the gospel kind of choir. He echoes things with different sections of his band. He's brilliant. And the challenge with Ellington on Columbia is he recorded a lot in the 30s and 40s. Columbia ends up owning a lot of that stuff as little labels are folding and being bought out. And so he's recording stuff in the now, mid-50s, at Columbia, and some great stuff. But they're also issuing a lot of that earlier material. So it can be a little tough to know what you're buying, but for the most part, Ellington's going to be great. And he's the architect of the entire thing. And from the avant-garde to the straight-ahead swing to modern jazz, it's all got Ellington's fingerprints all over it. And if you don't understand Ellington, you don't understand jazz. If you don't own Ellington, you're not really listening to jazz. You're hearing some of what his grandkids might have had to say, but you need to go back to Papa Bear. Very early on, Columbia brings over from Fantasy Records Dave Brubeck. And Dave Brubeck's West Coast cool. Dave Brubeck is white. We see as early as 566, which is shortly after that Baker record. He's on the label. And unlike Baker, who makes the one and is gone, Brubeck records tirelessly for Columbia. He puts out record after record after record. It's all great. It swings. It's as cool as it gets. In fact, if you look up the word cool in the dictionary, Paul Desmond's standing there like this. Sorry, it's me. I'm cool. Paul Desmond is that cream soda fountain. That's just sugar sweet all the time. And Brubeck just likes to put these little patterns and rhythms in there. Morello's a great drummer. These guys were bad. They really were. You'll never be annoyed by a Brubeck record, but it's also a bit of a revelation as to where Columbia was. And of course, this is like 55. By 59, Brubeck makes one of the great breakthroughs in jazz. And technically, this is a bit on the edge. And we don't really know it because we've heard it so much that we don't realize it has an edge to it. But this whole record's full of interesting time signatures. But they make them all so comfortable. And they make it all fit and feel and swing so well that it never really feels that uncomfortable. Blue Rondo While the Turk's an interesting beat, like a 9/8 or something like that. It's a Turkish beat. Brubeck should be in every collection, especially Time Out. We're popping champagne. Let that fire dim a little bit. Go put something cute on, baby. Brubeck. Don't go wrong with it. Don't miss it. Don't sleep on it. Now, Columbia, of all the major labels, is the one that's going to take a chance on black artists. They're going to branch out and recognize the importance of the black musician to jazz. And one of the first coups is he brings Miles Davis over from Prestige. And I've talked quite a bit about Miles on Prestige, and we talked about Kinda Blue as well. But Miles coming to Columbia was a real opening of the floodgates to jazz in Middle America. And that's probably the most important thing about Miles. Not his playing, it's his popularizing of this music and this vernacular to the mainstream. He really helps it get, with Columbia's power, from drugstores and little record shops from coast to coast. And he was unapologetically black. He was very much an angry, kind of bitter black guy. There's not a lot of smiling to be done from Miles Davis on any of his album covers. You know, which tells you a lot about a guy's personality. But he was accessible, and whether or not the historians want to admit it, Columbia to some degree shaped his direction. And he makes great records at Columbia. He makes some that are more targeting white America, and he makes some that are more targeting jazz purists. But yet very little of what Miles is doing at this period is being bought by black Americans. And I think Miles resented that. He brings, of course, his great quintet with him from Prestige. Paul Chambers, Philly Joe Jones, John Coltrane, and Red Garland. And he augments it with Cannonball Adderley at a few times and Bill Evans at times. But he makes Round About Midnight, Someday My Prince Will Come, Milestones. He makes a series of records here that are absolutely outstanding. And I would recommend for people to get the quintet stuff and get to know those before you buy the Gil Evans stuff. And there's 4 of them on Columbia, plus the one he did on Capitol. And if you want to be able to comprehend the Gil Evans stuff and how different it is, you should really get to know the standard quintet stuff first. Digest these records, understand the jazz, the swing, the feel, the urbanity of it. And then when you hear Sketches of Spain or Quiet Nights or Porgy and Bess, you'll recognize how different an audience this is targeting. And it's okay for an artist to want to broaden their horizons, but sometimes that motivation becomes financial, and that's going to compromise the art always. Sorry, it's just how it is. And it's not like I don't like the Gil Evans stuff. I'm just honest enough to recognize this was probably looking for a different audience than Blue Note was looking for. This originally had a cover with a white gal on it on a boat. He finally ex-nayed that. He put his wife on there. And those records, of course, Kind of Blue comes in 59. It's really meant to be kind of seen as a unit. One last thing I want to show you is in 58, this Jazz Track record. And side 1 is the soundtrack to La Censure, Le Chauffour, La Censure pour Le Chauffour. Something about the elevator lift to the top or something like that. It's called, it's a French film. Here's a soundtrack for that. On the second side, they squeeze in some quintet stuff. The version of On Green Dolphin Street, fantastic. Fantastic. Stella by Starlight. It's side 2 of this record is really the one that I had the Columbia mixed box set in my car on CD. I was driving Lyft for a couple years, and it's like 30 CDs, 40 CDs of Columbia, all with little album covers and stuff. It was in my glove box forever. And somebody stole this CD out of there, and my Roundabout Midnight, and my Milestones. That's the ones they took, the fuckers. I was like, well, whoever did it knew what he was doing. But, son of a bitch. You know, because I got left with all this Miles on the Round and all this kind of later Miles shit that I'm not going to play ever. So I got like 4 discs in there that I really want to listen to. Probably more like 10. You know, but the second quintet stuff, I love 7 Steps to Heaven for some reason. I think it's fantastic. But this version of Green Dolphins is fantastic, and it's to be sought out. If you stumble on Jazz Track, grab it. It's one of the other real big important pieces here for Columbia in 1959 was they recorded Mingus, and Mingus, Better Get Hit in Your Soul. Mingus brings an edge and a slice of the avant-garde that really has been missing at Columbia to this point. And this is also 1959, if I recall. And so by 59, you see Columbia starting to put out risky jazz. And you have to applaud them, because Decca, Capitol, RCA weren't anywhere there yet. They still needed white guys in nice little ties and suits playing that Negro music. They weren't about to have blacks playing black music, expressing black opinions. And Columbia is always going to be slightly more polished than those mid-major labels, the Blue Notes, the Prestige. It's always going to have a bit more of a studio budget, probably some bigger engineer producer in there. It doesn't, not to say that they don't make some great jazz records, and they absolutely do. Mingus was a big step for Columbia. It was a big step for Mingus. Mingus probably wasn't someone I'd want to spend much time with. He was a bit of an asshat. which a lot of eccentric geniuses kind of are. But nevertheless, he's an important part in the movements and the abstractions of jazz. Something else I want to cover here, and I've talked about these records, of course, in the Art Blakey series, the Jazz Messenger stuff. At the same time, actually before the Mingus and even before the Kind of Blue, they put out these two Messenger records. These are lovely 6-sides, both of them. And Mobley, Byrd, Watkins, Silver. It's beastly hard bop. It drives. It's at tempo. It's unafraid to be black, and it's as black as it gets. And kudos to Columbia for putting these two out. You would be remiss to ever pass these over. Even in reissue, grab them. They're absolutely fantastic. And the Jazz Messengers, if someone were to ask you, explain to me what black jazz sounds like. What's the difference between white and black jazz? The Jazz Messengers is one of the clearest cut examples of the ferocity, the intensity, the tension, the barrage. It's just not, excuse me, miss, may I have a cookie? It's, we're coming in, and just better learn to deal with what we're doing, because we ain't taking a break. I just found this on vinyl recently as an old pressing, and I've had a reissue for years. But once again, $9.98, so we're probably talking 1958 here. Gigi Burst and Donald Byrd, Gigi Grice, I don't know what I said, but Donald Byrd. These two make a hard bop record, very modern. It's a beautiful record, actually, and a beautiful copy. I found this in the wild for like $25. I was thrilled. Made my Sunday. My brunch wasn't that good, but finding this record upstairs in the coffee shop bookstore, I was like, okay, it's a deal. I'll take that. Byrd is one of the great players, of course, at Blue Note throughout the 60s, one of the fusion giants of the 70s. Gigi Grice makes a number of records at Prestige on New Jazz. These two guys are both very modern, forward-thinking players, and there's a black expression going on here that, again, before the Jazz Messengers and before this, Miles would have been it, and Miles came from a middle-class background, so his emoting was never the same as these poor black young youths who got the chance to speak. And ultimately, that's part of the importance and the integrity of jazz, is the poverty and desperation of these young men is part of what is so important. It's what's informing the entire process. I'm going to shout out to a guy here that's a little bit very underappreciated. It's a promo copy of that. He's a guy that, to me, plays with all the beauty of Miles, all the sound of Chet, all the love of Art Farmer. It's Joe Wilder. And he comes to Columbia, makes a few records here as a leader, but he makes his bread and butter as a side guy. And whether it's the singers on Columbia or whether it's as a sideman on other labels, he's recording for years. But his few records as a leader are really pretty wonderful. And the nice thing about guys like this, Joe Wilder, this is a brother that most fat folks don't know about. So you can find a Joe Wilder LP, dollar bin, $6, $10 if the guy really wants to get. I think this copy, which was a promo copy in mint condition, was $20. Wonderful picture of New York in the background, kind of up on a rooftop somewhere. Joe Wilder, don't be afraid to buy guys like this when you see them. They got a story to tell. And that's what this music's about, the story to tell. Not about the pressing, not about your equipment, not about how important your speakers are and how your style is. What is the story telling you? I've said it 100 times and I'm going to say it again. If you got Tom Sawyer and you're talking to me about the paper and the ink and the book binding, you didn't read the fucking book. The story's what matters. Talk to me about Huck Finn. Talk to me about that Mighty River. Because if you ain't doing that, you ain't talking about it. Part of this process was me talking about records I love. And I love this record. Lambert, Hendrix, and Ross. They are a vocal trio, and they're all jazz singers in the purest sense, where they scat, they bebop, they will play chordal movements. Excuse me. That's not an arranged horn section. That's not an organ. That's three voices playing blocks of chords and how they arrange their voices. And I've always enjoyed their records. Excuse me. John Hendricks, one of the great storytellers in jazz. He's around forever. He was still talking into the Ken Burns documentary about jazz and storytelling. If you find this record for $5, buy it. It's fun. I think on side 2 they do moaning. Let's check it out. Maybe it's on this one. Fun stuff. Can't really go wrong with it. And like jazz has so many various formations. We don't need to define it as narrow as we often do. The scope of it is as wide as our comprehension is. And improvisation and swing are kind of the two defining things. And that improvisation and swing are vehicles for the emoting to take place. And that's the determining factor of what the music's value is. Where's that emoting coming from? Am I emoting to make money? Am I emoting because I have a soul I want to express? Am I emoting because I'm trying to imitate somebody else? That's the wild card. It's not the instrument that you're playing on. It's not the genre you're playing in. It's not how you play. If you're swinging and you're improvising, that's got a lot of jazz elements right there. So it's those two vehicles need that passenger of emotion. Where is this human being who is playing me coming from? And that takes some empathy and listening on our part, perception. A record I found pretty recently, and I gotta say, I just love it. It became really a favorite very quickly. It's the great Oscar Brown. We're talking Columbia 1577. So probably 62, 63 in there. Maybe 61 even. But he's a great singer-storyteller. He's putting words to bebop songs, hard bop songs. This is Bobby Timmons' That Dare, with Oscar Brown improvising words on top. He does Natty's Work song on here. This record is a fun listen. It's black vaudeville, it's comedic, it's tongue-in-cheek, it's naughty, it's body, there's a song about a guy selling a black woman slave, that he uses comedy and sarcasm to drive home the terror. It's a brilliant record. And last on Columbia, we're going to talk about Thelonious Monk. He's another guy they brought over, in this case from Riverside, and probably about 62 they bring him over, maybe 61. And he makes a lot of records for Columbia. He ends up being there for a long time. And we've talked a little bit about Monk on some of my other episodes, but we're going to dig into him a little bit again here. Monk's the king of space. He's the king of the avant. He knows how to make anything interesting. I prefer him in trio settings the most because he can, drummers and bass players can tend to stay with him the best. A lot of his Columbia stuff is really, really great. And the thing about being on Columbia is it's going to inflate your position in jazz to some degree. And Monk didn't get a lot of credit during his lifetime, especially during his early years at Blue Note, Prestige. When he goes to Riverside, he makes some brilliant records. He starts getting some recognition. But it wasn't until later in his life when he's on the major label Columbia, making records that aren't as groundbreaking as they were early, where he starts to get the renown. And thank God he did. He deserves every bit of it. But again, we get our opinions often shaped by popularity. And so we hear the Miles Columbia, we hear the Monk Columbia, and we often don't recognize the sacrifices that the Miles put in to get there. And these guys traveled some very difficult roads. And it's just something that I think white Americans have a hard time grasping. We have a hard time quantifying the struggle of the black American male. And I think you need to really sit and think about that experience, that persecution, that feeling of being an outsider. Every time you walk into any restaurant, not being able to play and go to the bathroom where you're asleep while you're playing. There's a lot of indignancies thrown on you every day. Being called boy, being called nigger. It was a very difficult road to walk. It required a great deal of humility and that Armstrong forgiveness that I talked about the other day. You got to be able to forgive. If you carry the weight and the bitterness against these people who oppress you, it's going to weigh you down. And I think for a lot of these men, jazz, via the Armstrong recipe, becomes a way to forgive. I can entertain you. I can prove my sophistication to you. I can make you tap your foot. I can even make you give me your money and spend money on my records. And even if your mind hasn't changed, on some level you're learning to respect me. And that requires a forgiveness. It requires a humble understanding of your situation and knowing the limitations of what you can change. And I don't think most of us with our entitled white privilege have any grasping of what it's like to live in those conditions. I think we live so in denial about our own history in America. We don't think that we're capable of great evil, but great evil lurks in our very recent past. And the legacy of it is still omnipresent. And it's still, we tear at the seams of it all the time to keep us in conflict, to keep us in fear, to keep us divided. Jazz is such an amazing, amazing place. And Columbia does a great job of bringing it to the world. Things that small labels could never have dreamt of doing. Selling them in Europe, Amsterdam, Vienna, Italy, England, France. Small labels didn't have that reach. Small labels didn't get to Missouri. Columbia got everywhere. And it unfortunately shapes everyone's opinion of what jazz is, because that's the jazz they really get to hear and know first. Because there's so much more to jazz than Brubeck, but better Brubeck than nothing. And Brubeck should entice you to hear Miles and Monk, and then maybe some jazz messengers, and then you can really dig in to the core of this music, where there's a power that can transform, that can heal, that can bring unity. It's the greatest art form in American history, one of the greatest art forms in the history of the world. Archaeologists dig out old records and listen to them and tell me what you feel. Don't tell me the pressing, tell me what it makes you feel. Tell me what it makes you think. That's the empathy that is required to hear this music and make it move you. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. Peace.